For every single one of our ancestors, the sky wasn't a passive backdrop. It was a living system of gods, signs, and cosmic order. The sun rose, the moon cycled, the stars moved with purpose. When those patterns held, life felt stable. Sometimes they didn't. An eclipse shattered that order. Without warning, the sky could darken in the middle of the day. The sun, constant and life-giving, would vanish behind a black disk. Or the full moon, bright and reassuring, would bleed red and disappear. Animals fell silent. People screamed. Crops wilted. Soldiers dropped their weapons. To the ancient world, this wasn't a phenomenon. It was a threatened act of the gods, or worse, across cultures and continents. Eclipses were feared, recorded, and mythologized. Some tried to explain them, a few learned to predict them, but most just endured them. And in some cases, these celestial events changed history, stopping wars, ending reigns, or triggering blood sacrifices to keep the heavens in balance. This is not a story about astronomy. It's about fear, power, and how ancient humans reacted when the sky turned against them. Before telescopes, before astronomy, before science itself had a name, ancient humans looked to the sky not for knowledge, but for meaning. The sun and moon weren't objects, they were forces. Divine, dependable, and tied to the survival of everything on Earth. So when either one suddenly disappeared, it wasn't treated as a rare event. It was a crisis. A solar eclipse where the moon passes between the Earth and sun can turn day into night in just minutes. Temperatures drop, birds stop singing, shadows distort. A lunar eclipse can make the moon glow red, as if soaked in blood. To modern observers, it's a spectacle. But to ancient people, these events were cosmic violations, breaches in the order of things. The sky for a moment was broken, and they had no idea if it would be fixed. Nearly every major ancient civilization viewed eclipses as supernatural threats. In Mesopotamia, lunar eclipses were believed to be attacks on the king. The Babylonians had state-sponsored astrologers, whose job was not only to interpret the heavens, but to protect the throne from what the sky might foretell. If an eclipse was predicted on, the Babylonians were among the first to do so. They would appoint a temporary substitute king. This person, often a prisoner or servant, would wear the crown for a short time. Once the eclipse passed, he would be killed, and the real king would resume his rule. Symbolically spared by the heavens, the Chinese saw eclipses through the lens of celestial balance. According to early texts, a solar eclipse was caused by a celestial dragon devouring the sun. When one occurred in 2134 BCE, 2 imperial court astronomers failed to predict it. They were executed. Eclipses were state-level emergencies, and prediction was a matter of survival, not scholarship. Over time, Chinese astronomers developed some of the world's earliest eclipse prediction methods, using lunar cycles and calendar patterns. But at its root, their knowledge was still driven by fear, because if the prediction failed, so might the dynasty. In India, mythology framed eclipses as acts of revenge. The demon Rahu, according to Hindu legend, was beheaded by the gods but survived. His severed head flies through the sky, occasionally catching and swallowing the sun or moon, causing eclipses. Temples rang bells, villagers banged drums, and people chanted to scare Rahu away and restore cosmic order. Even today, in parts of South Asia, people avoid eating or drinking during eclipses. A holdover from these ancient beliefs, the Maya of Central America tracked eclipses with astonishing precision. In their world, celestial events weren't random, they were ritually significant, woven into politics, religion, and human sacrifice. Their codices, especially the Dresden Codex, contained detailed eclipse tables. Priests used these to prepare sacrifices at the exact moment when the gods would be watching. A miscalculation could bring ruin. The Maya understood the math, but the meaning behind the eclipses remained deeply spiritual and ominous. These events weren't just predictable, they were scheduled confrontations with the divine in the Norse tradition. The sun and moon were chased through the sky by wolves, When one was caught, an eclipse occurred. This was not a poetic tale, it was cosmic danger in narrative form. The wolf's skull would one day succeed in catching the sun, and that would signal the beginning of Ragnarok, the end of the world. In that worldview, every eclipse was a dress rehearsal for total collapse. The Inca believed eclipses signaled that the sun god Inti was angry. They responded with ritual fasts, sacrifices, and public weeping. In Africa, among the Bata Maliba of Togo and Benin, eclipses were seen as fights between the sun and moon. It was the community's responsibility to make peace between them. People would settle disputes, perform public acts of forgiveness, and restore social harmony to mirror what they hoped the sky would do. Even cultures that recorded the motion of celestial bodies with scientific detail often left eclipses out of their public writings. The ancient Egyptians, despite their astronomical sophistication, rarely if ever mentioned eclipses in their surviving records. Some historians believe this was deliberate, a kind of cultural censorship. Eclipses were possibly too terrifying, too powerful, or too disruptive to include in temple carvings or official texts. Others suggest the knowledge may have been kept among the priesthood and not shared with the public. What's consistent across all these civilizations is that eclipses were never ignored. They were moments of fear, of uncertainty, and of desperate ritual. In many cases, they were blamed for unrelated disasters, plagues, failed harvests, or the deaths of rulers. Because they were so rare and dramatic, they demanded explanation. And without science, mythology filled the gap. There are documented cases where eclipses changed the course of history. One of the most well-known occurred during a battle in 585 BCE between the Medes and Lydians in what is now modern-day Turkey. As the two armies fought, the sky suddenly went dark. Terrified, both sides stopped fighting and agreed to peace. Historians believe the eclipse was likely predicted by the philosopher Thales of Miletus, though how accurately he understood it remains debated. What's not debated is the effect. The battle ended instantly. In this case, the eclipse didn't just inspire fear. It stopped a war. To modern viewers, an eclipse is something to photograph, to live stream, or to mark on a calendar. But for most of human history, it was the moment when everything known seemed to fall apart. Light became darkness. The predictable became unstable. No one, not priest, king, or commoner, knew if it would ever go back to normal. Most ancient people feared eclipses. Few tried to understand them, and fewer still figured out how to predict them. For those who did, this knowledge granted power, sometimes reverence, sometimes suspicion, sometimes fear. Accurate eclipse prediction in the ancient world was extremely rare. It required not only long-term sky observation, but also record-keeping that spanned decades, even centuries. Most societies did not last that long. But in places where priesthoods, scribes, or astronomer priests had institutional stability, they began to notice something unsettling. Eclipses weren't entirely random, but they came back. The Babylonians were likely the first to make real progress. By the 7th century BCE, scholars in Mesopotamia had uncovered the Saros-Sokola pattern, in which solar and lunar eclipses repeat every 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. They didn't know the orbital mechanics behind it, but they knew it worked. Babylonian clay tablets contain eclipse records stretching back centuries. The priests of Babylon could not only name the date of a future eclipse, they could name the general region where it would be visible. This made them dangerous. To their kings, these men were invaluable. If an eclipse could foretell a ruler's death, then someone who could forecast one had direct access to fate. But to the public, the same knowledge could look like sorcery. Prediction meant proximity. To divine forces onto anyone who got too close to those forces was treated with suspicion or awe. In China, similar discoveries were made through rigorous state-funded astronomy. The ancient Chinese developed a lunisolar calendar by the 1st millennium BCE, tracking both the moon's phases and its position relative to the sun and stars. Through pattern recognition, they also began predicting eclipses. What's notable is that these predictions were government-controlled knowledge. Predicting an eclipse wasn't public information. It was imperial intelligence. Getting it wrong could cost you your life. as it did for the two court astronomers in the 2100s BCE who failed to warn the Shia dynasty of an impending solar eclipse. Their deaths weren't symbolic, they were a message. Understanding the sky wasn't about curiosity, it was about duty and control. The Maya achieved even more impressive results without access to telescopes or modern tools. By the first millennium CE, Mayan astronomer priests were capable of predicting eclipses based on detailed calendrical systems. Their Dresden Codex, a pre-Columbian bark paper book, contains a series of tables that track the timing of solar and lunar eclipses across 11,960 days. Intervals, an astonishing accomplishment for a civilization that lacked even metal tools. The Maya believed eclipses were tied to cosmic cycles of death and renewal, often linked to gods battling in the underworld. Their predictions weren't used to comfort or protect, but to schedule sacrifices. During predicted eclipses, priests would perform ritual bloodletting or kill captives in public ceremonies. The timing wasn't for dramatic effect. It was believed to be necessary, a way of feeding the gods during a moment of celestial vulnerability. The eclipse wasn't just a moment of darkness. It was a crack in the wall between worlds. In India, astronomical texts like the Surya Siddhanta show knowledge of lunar nodes points where the orbits of the sun and moon intersect, which are crucial for predicting eclipses. These points were mythologized as Rahu and Ketu demons, responsible for swallowing the sun and moon. But behind the stories were calculations, geometric models passed down by Brahmin astronomers. Indian eclipse prediction, like Babylonian, was deeply tied to cosmic order and kingship. And just like in other cultures, failing to predict one could shake public confidence or worse. The Greeks, particularly in the Hellenistic period, merged myth and math. Early Greek philosophers like Thales of Miletus were said to have predicted eclipses, though modern historians debate how accurate those predictions were. By the 3rd century BCE, astronomers like Hipparchus had modeled the geometry of the Earth-Moon-Sun system. Using trigonometry and observations of lunar eclipses, he calculated the moon's distance from Earth with surprising accuracy. But the most sophisticated Greek device wasn't a theory, it was a machine. Discovered in 1901 in a shipwreck off the coast of Antikythera, the Antikythera mechanism is a bronze analog computer from around 100 BCE. It could track lunar phases, planetary positions, and predict both solar and lunar eclipses using a hand-cranked system of gears. This device wasn't just ancient, it was centuries ahead of its time. It was technological proof that at least some people in the ancient world could predict eclipses with mechanical precision. Still, such knowledge was almost always kept out of public hands. In most cultures, predicting an eclipse wasn't about calming the public, it was about maintaining control. The Maya used it to set ritual calendars. The Babylonians used it to manage royal anxiety. The Chinese used it to reinforce imperial authority. Rarely did anyone say, "Don't worry, it's just an eclipse." Instead, they said, "We saw this coming. We know what it means. You should be afraid." Even when predictions were accurate, the mood didn't shift to wonder. It shifted to ritual urgency. Priests sacrificed animals, villagers fasted, fires were lit, bells were rung. Noise was made to drive away whatever invisible force had dared touch the sun. The knowledge never became neutral, it stayed dangerous. It's worth noting that most people, farmers, builders, soldiers, laborers, had no idea eclipses followed patterns. They didn't read the Dresden Codex or study sorrow cycles. They only saw the sky go black and assumed the gods were angry. That divide between those who feared and those who forecast was enormous. And it defined how civilizations responded. In the end, predicting eclipses didn't make them any less terrifying. It only changed who controlled the fear. An eclipse doesn't last long. Solar eclipse might darken the sky for just a few minutes. A lunar eclipse may drag across the night for hours. But in the ancient world, those minutes were long enough to reshape history. The sky was a theater of omens, and eclipses, rare, dramatic, and unsettling, were the main event. When they came, people didn't just look up, they acted, sometimes violently, sometimes strategically, sometimes not at all, because they were too afraid to move. One of the most famous examples happened in 585 BCE. During a war between the Medes and the Lydians in what is now modern-day Turkey, the two armies had been locked in brutal combat for years. Then, during a battle, the sun vanished from the sky. A solar eclipse, later calculated by astronomers to have occurred on May 28, 585 BCE, swept across the battlefield. Soldiers dropped their weapons. The fighting stopped instantly. Both sides interpreted the event as a divine command in order to stop killing. Truce was negotiated on the spot. The battle ended not because of diplomacy, but because the sky turned black. The philosopher Thales of Miletus is credited with predicting the eclipse. Whether he truly did, or whether the story was embellished later to bolster Greek scientific prestige, is unclear. What matters is that his name became attached to it, turning him into a symbol of human mastery over divine signs. If the heavens could be read, it could be prepared for, and that was a radical idea at the time. But not all rulers wanted eclipses explained. In many ancient kingdoms, an eclipse meant that the ruler's time was ending. In Babylon, it was common practice to place a substitute king on the throne during a predicted eclipse. This substitute, a low-ranking noble, servant, or even prisoner, would rule in name only. Once the eclipse passed, he would be executed, ritually absorbing the bad omen while the real king resumed power. The act was symbolic, superstitious, and brutal. But it shows how seriously eclipses were taken. You didn't just fear them, you built policy around them. In Assyria, royal inscriptions sometimes credited victories or disasters to celestial events. If a ruler expanded the empire during a solar eclipse, the conquest might be framed as divinely approved. If the empire suffered defeat, the eclipse would be cited as a warning ignored. This wasn't spin. It was state theology, a system where the skies were part of the chain of command. In Rome, eclipses were recorded alongside plagues, fires, and assassinations. In 59 CE, the Roman historian Pliny the Elder wrote that eclipses were natural, supernatural, but most of the public didn't agree. Centuries earlier, after the assassination of Julius Caesar, a total solar eclipse was observed during his funeral games. Too many Romans, it was not just coincidence. The sun disappearing was seen as a celestial mourning, the heavens reacting to the fall of a great man. Later emperors would use eclipses to promote their divinity, suggesting the skies were aligning with their fates. But fear remained the dominant emotion. In Islamic history, the Prophet Muhammad's infant son, Ibrahim, died on the same day as a solar eclipse. People claimed the sky had darkened in sorrow. Muhammad rejected that idea, saying eclipses were signs of God's power, not linked to human births or deaths. This was a notable exception, a leader actively demystifying an eclipse in a time when most did the opposite. Elsewhere, the terror remained visceral. In Mesoamerican cultures like the Aztec and Mixtec, eclipses were often believed to signal impending disaster or the need for human sacrifice. One Mixtec codex shows warriors and priests performing bloodletting rituals during an eclipse, standing under a blackened sun, pleading for cosmic balance. The Mexica, an Aztec subgroup, believed an eclipse could unleash monsters, and that pregnant women must hide indoors to avoid spiritual contamination. In India, solar and lunar eclipses were embedded into political calendars. The Mughal emperors often scheduled public religious rituals around eclipse dates to demonstrate piety and cosmic awareness. But further back, in the Vedic period, eclipses were occasions for fasting, purification, and isolation. Astrologers issued warnings. Kings delayed military campaigns. Armies refused to march under an eclipsed sun. Decisions were suspended because the sky was no longer trustworthy, even in medieval Europe. Where Christian theology had begun to overshadow older pagan beliefs, eclipses were still seen as signs of judgment. In 1133 CE, a total eclipse swept across England. Shortly afterward, King Henry I died. Chroniclers described the event as a dark omen, a prelude to disaster. And disaster came. Civil war erupted. plunging the country into decades of instability known as the anarchy. What made eclipses so dangerous in these societies wasn't just what they was what they could be made to mean. A ruler who could tie his fate to the sky, either through prediction or association, gained mystical legitimacy. A rival could do the same. And for ordinary people, the eclipse was an unarguable sign from above. It was visible, undeniable, and powerful, an event no one could fake. Even when societies became more advanced in their astronomy, the symbolic weight of eclipses persisted. In 1504, Christopher Columbus used a predicted lunar eclipse to manipulate the indigenous Arawak people of Jamaica. While stranded and low on supplies, he warned the locals that his god was angry with them for not providing food. On cue, the moon turned. Red, terrified, the Arawak resumed feeding Columbus and his crew. He didn't explain the sorrow cycle. He used it. Because knowledge, when no one else has it, just becomes leverage. That moment reveals something central to the ancient relationship with eclipses. Even when the fear could be understood, it could still be weaponized. The eclipse never needed to be. Magic it only needed to be rare, shocking, and publicly visible. Everything else, sacrifice, surrender, war, or peace, was about who told the story afterward. In a world where most events were uncertain, an eclipse was a clear signal. It didn't matter if it was natural. What mattered was who interpreted it first. Eclipses are not random. They follow cycles. They can be predicted down to the second today. But for most of human history, they were terrifying. Sudden, personal. The sky turning black wasn't an event. It was a message. And across thousands of years, across every known civilization, that message was usually the same. Something is wrong. They triggered wars, ended them, crowned kings, unseated them. They caused sacrifices, changed calendars, and silenced entire cities. The fear they generated wasn't weakness, it was structure. Because when the sun disappeared, the question wasn't just what happened. It was who caused this, and what must we do to fix it? A few ancient cultures came close to understanding the pattern, but even they didn't let go of the fear. Because knowledge didn't erase the darkness. It just gave someone the power to control the story that came with it. We no longer fear eclipses, but the need to explain what we see in the sky remains. The wrong explanation, at the wrong time, still changes the course of human history. The sun disappears. People panic. Someone steps forward and says, "I knew this would happen." And the world listens.